The gallery was half lit the way a chest is half full, enough to breathe. Not yet enough to say everything out loud. Tracklights glowed in modest cones across the white walls. The rest of the room held in a soft dusk that knew better than to compete. A ladder leaned like an unfinished sentence. Cotton gloves waited like polite instructions. The air carried varnish, oil, a thin citrus from a recent clean. Veronica walked the line of wall with that combination of ownership and rehearsal that marks a good gallerist, counting steps under her breath. Tapping a knuckle once at the seam where two drywall panels met. Glancing at the floor to confirm the sightline she preferred. She had the stillness of people who lead. Not by volume but by calibration. "Let's run the main spine," she said, meaning the axis of work the rest would harmonize with. Cass arrived like a temperature change, jacket half-zipped. Color on her lips the exact red of confidence. She tossed me a roll of hanging wire and caught my eye as if taking my measure were a sport. "Don't be too serious," she said, holding a frame while I eased it onto the hook and steadied the ladder with a boot. "Art needs heat," she said, heat like a technical term. The frame settled. My wrist, already steady, got steadier when her fingers pressed the corner into plane. She didn't move for a heartbeat longer than necessary, then stepped back as if giving the wall its turn. Eve stood at the light panel, unhurried, precise. She had the kind of beauty that refuses fuss and so ends up lasting. 30 degrees, she said, watching the reflection pass over glass and vanish. Keeps glare off the glazing. She dimmed, brightened, dimmed again, reading my choices like a score. When I lifted the next piece, she held the beam steady on the canvas rather than my hands. It felt like trust. We moved as if we had done this together 100 times. Which was a trick of attention as much as experience. Veronica marked heights with blue painter's tape. I climbed and hung. Cass tightened D-rings and ran the level with her thumbnail against the bubble. More candid than careful but efficient enough to deserve the label. Eve drifted behind us with the dimmer, watching how the whites cooled and warmed, how shadows lengthened and then shook themselves awake. The first piece that mattered tonight, a heavy impasto, blue on blue with a cobalt scar, resisted the hook with a small, proprietary fight. I felt the weight travel down the ladder into my calves and made the micro-corrections that keep pride from becoming a hole in the wall. Cass's hand came up reflexively, thumb grazing my wrist as she steadied. "There," she said, like a climber feeling the hold she wants. The frame breathed into position. The room accepted it. Eve watched my face, not the frame. "You lingered at this one last week," she said. "Why?" She was still at the dimmer, but the light waiting on her fingertips made it a conversation about more than bulbs. "Texture keeps time," I said, surprised by the answer as it left. "Brush marks stay when the day leaves." It's honest about the hours it took. Veronica glanced up then, a half-second longer than the glance required, but continued her path down the wall. Responsible eye first, interested eye later. She toggled a switch. Lights went down, back up, down again, the space's pulse making itself known. "We'll try a salon cluster on the left," she said, and line hung on the right. "Keep the joints disciplined. Let the cluster do the talking." Cass smirked. "Let the cluster do the shouting." Eve smiled without showing it. "Light tells the truth about whoever hangs it." She returned the cone to its perch on the impasto and made it glow like a thing that had been paid a compliment without being asked. The back room was colder. The concrete honest about its nature. Stacks of frames leaned like weather-stranded travelers. A box of glazing stood open, each sheet in felt sleeves. Eve led me there with a crate in her arms, her shoulder barely brushing the door as it swung behind us and shut with a soft gong. The room remembered for a breath longer than a sound should last. In the brief occlusion from the main space, the world got simpler: cardboard, wood, the satin shush of velvet dust covers. She didn't fill the air with utility. "Which one held you?" she asked. "When you walked the room?" "I stood longest in front of the blue," I said, "because of time." "What would you have told it?" she asked, "if no one else had been listening?" "That I know how long it takes," I said, then heard how that could mean more than paint, and that it owes no one an apology for it. Her eyes warmed but didn't go soft. Approval without the condescension of comfort. Good. She set the crate down, adjusted the label so its corners met their own rules, and waited with me until the sound of the door stopped telling anyone what to think. Then she lifted the top frames as if the act had always been meant to be shared. We carried them back together. Veronica's phone rang with the particular urgency of someone else's deadline. She listened, eyes moving to the front as if she could already see the truck backing up. "The shipment's early," she said to her son, who had been coiling wire at the counter. "Can you run down and sign off? They'll need the loading dock key." He grinned, put on his jacket, and went. The door's glass took the city's reflection with it when it closed. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was articulate. Cass opened wine with the skill of someone who prefers competence to ceremony. Bread appeared, imperfect and therefore appetizing. "Don't fear crumbs," she said, handing me a plate and sitting closer than strictly necessary. "Life needs a mess." The knife's backside touched the ridge of my thumb as she slid the cheese onto my plate. "The skin there is thin." I felt the informality as a design choice. "I'm fine," I said, when Eve's look tilted its question at me. It was the kind of check that understood a no and didn't punish a yes. She ended it with the smallest nod, as if making a notation in a ledger only she would ever read. Veronica poured a small glass for each of us, not as a party trick but to control the room's pace. She kept conversation tethered to the work long enough for the work to be honored. Salon clusters. The risk of turning people into furniture if the hang is too low. The elegance of a line that doesn't have to prove itself by snobbery. Artists who learned to deserve their labels and those who would have to. She never squeezed meaning out of anything that couldn't yield it. We ate at the counter. Elbows not quite touching. The glass cool where it met the fingers and warm where it met the palm. The playlist in the ceiling speakers dropped its volume until the bass was less a sound than a suggestion. The gallery released its stern daytime posture and let something like the possibility of hospitality sit where the reception desk usually did. Cass angled toward me and, in the angle, new information arrived. She kept her voice self-mocking enough to be kind. "Are you the choose type or the dodge type?" "Choosing," I said, "is how dodging gets interesting." She liked that more than she let on. "Careful," she said, this time not as a warning but as a compliment. She took another slice of bread and offered me the knife handle first. On purpose. Eve stood by the panel and clicked the track in increments until the brightness felt less like retail and more like regard. The wall gathered our earlier decisions and made something like a theory out of them. The blue held the center. The warm varnished landscape steadied the left. A small, fierce portrait drew the kind of audience that knows a stare is an act. Veronica didn't pretend the room wasn't changing. She walked into the long silence that came next and sat on the bench alone with it so we wouldn't have to. It did not break her. It broke into a second, clearer version of itself and invited me to join it. I did. We looked at one another as if a painting hung between us instead of air. When she looked away, it wasn't toward the exit. It was toward the dimmer. We were 4 adults. The door was glass. The street was pretending to mind its own business. The present tense. Practiced all evening under the cover of work. Asked for equal time. I took a breath to fit it. "If we're going to talk about what this is," I said, and my voice surprised me by being even. "I need to say what it cannot do." Cass's chin rose. "Not defying. Attending." Eve turned from the panel but didn't step between me and the light. Veronica's posture didn't move at all, which told me more than any movement might have. "It can't break what you are to each other," I said. "It can't leak into the room when you're working. It can't be gossip. It can't decide for anyone who they are in their own house." I felt each condition as I set it down, like weights being added to a scale until it balanced. And it stops the second anyone says stop. No proof required. "That's the frame," Eve said, approving the hang. Cass ran a finger along the bench edge as if checking for dust. "I want to," she said, then added the missing half before anyone had to request it. "And I'm comfortable." She didn't pose the line as a dare. She offered it as the fastest way to spare us all pretense. Veronica stood and crossed to the front windows. The velvet curtain was tied back from earlier. She slipped the knot and pulled. The fabric moved with a whisper that the room felt on its skin. Streetlight diluted and then withdrew. We stayed lit by our own choices. Don't let the streetlights define us, she said. She didn't say what would define us. She trusted us to know. Eve took her place at my side as if the floor had registered the shape we made. I agree, she said, steady, with respect and discretion. She left the rest unsaid because she knew words have to pay rent and some of them can't afford this neighborhood. Veronica faced us head on. Curator to the last. If anyone is still unsure, she said, say it now. If not, then let's stop pretending. Ran joy de ju nhau en tone, kong fi de cam yer thung. I said in my own language first, because the thought had arrived that way. Then in English, because understanding is a kind of hospitality. Boundaries keep us safe. They don't forbid affection. No one asked for permission after that. We all already had it. The track lights softened, whether by Eve's hand or the building's slow exhale. I can't say. The sounds that followed were the credible sounds of a room that knows it is being trusted. Fabric moving where it always planned to move. Breath taking the measure of the new air and finding it kinder than expected. The velvet curtain giving a second small sigh as it settled fully against the glass. If you had been outside, you would have seen nothing that explained the way attention changes a space from the inside. If you had been inside, you would have missed nothing essential for lack of description. Sometimes not saying is the most literate way to speak. Morning arrived like a primer layer, thin, opaque enough to unify the surface for whatever came next. The gallery smelled different, but not by much. Espresso had added its opinion. So had fresh paper from a ream of labels. The varnish, less obvious now the room had slept, remembered itself only when the HVAC crossed a seam and sighed. Veronica handed me a croissant without a speech attached to it. Eve set an espresso at my right hand and adjusted the handle to face the angle I prefer. Cass had tied her hair back, which on her looked like a choice to be precise rather than a concession to labor. We occupied the same bench that had hosted last night's silence. It didn't hold a grudge. We should make a pact that doesn't humiliate us later, Veronica said. She didn't say later when or where. She looked at the wall that still held the blue. In here, we are colleagues first. No performance. No intimacy where the work is supposed to be seen. Agreed, Eve said, with the happiness of a minimalist given permission to keep a line clean. Clarity is kindness. Outside, Cass said, softer than her color. We're adults. We keep it discreet. We don't overpromise. She glanced at me without romance and with interest. If jealousy knocks, we answer with words, not guesses. We only schedule when all four of us want to and can carry it. I said, one no is a no. Anyone can stop at any time. It's a boundary, not a problem. Veronica added the last necessary thing, which is what people like her are for. We use a single thread to communicate. No one is edited out by inertia. If something changes, we tell one another before the rumor does. We each repeated the list in a different way. I wrote it down in my head with the meticulousness that has occasionally annoyed friends and saved projects. Eve aligned 3 label sheets so their corners knew what right angles were for. Cass patted her pocket for a pen she always had. Veronica circled the floor with a slow, certain look that rehung reality without needing to touch it. The door chimed because doors have very little imagination. A courier stacked flat boxes by the desk. Veronica signed, tore her copy, and handed it back with a thank you that turned the exchange into a moment instead of a transaction. She tossed me the tape gun. I cut, folded, filed, grateful for a task I could do well while the new day put on its audience. The track lights, when Eve clicked them to full for the first time, made a sound I'd never noticed before. A tiny metal technique that resembled the punctuation a sentence makes when it knows it's done. The wall found its voice. The blue asserted the kind of centrality that doesn't have to apologize. A small, amused still life I hadn't taken seriously last night turned suddenly competent in the light. The label I was about to print felt more important than the average truth. Cass came to stand beside me. And because the morning had room for jokes. She murmured, "When the track lights are on, we go to our marks." She lifted a strand of hair from her collar and tied it into the knot. "When they're off, well, we'll know." Eve checked the labels, not hovering, auditing. "Dates are correct," she said, "accents where they belong." She put one hand on the printer as it spat the next square of card, and the gesture was intimate without being proprietary. Gratitude offered to a machine for doing its job. A text chimed on Veronica's phone. Her son, trucks clear. Headed back. "Need anything?" she wrote. "Coffee beans if you pass a place." Then she looked at us the way she had looked at the wall yesterday, deciding where the lines were. "Last night was an adult decision," she said. "This morning is a professional one." Both are true. The first visitor came as a silhouette against the glass. He entered with the unsentimental air of someone who buys paintings without needing them to change his life. He paused under the blue, which told me he might have more sense than he dressed for. "Strong hang," he said to Veronica, who agreed without saying yes. I took up the level and moved to the far wall to adjust a stubborn corner that refused to sit at 6 feet center. Veronica met me there with a second level so we could box it like a cross-check rather than a correction. Cass walked past and pressed a pair of fresh cotton gloves into my palm without breaking stride. Eve shadowed the buyer in a way that made his looking feel private and correct. We had returned to our marks without breaking the pact that would travel with us out of the gallery when the lights switched off again. The morning ran on competence and a style of quiet that is the natural consequence of people who like one another doing what they're good at. The courier came back. Cass signed with an economy that made the flourish at the end look deserved. Eve found a scratch on a frame no one else would have seen and corrected it with a marker and a breath. I remeasured a center and marked it with blue tape, trusting the color's honesty more than any number. Veronica answered an email without letting her tone sag into apology or tilt into superiority. When Tom returned with coffee, he registered the air and didn't ask for a story that wasn't his. He set the bag on the counter, kissed his mother's cheek in a way that took me back to the night before and then away from it, and went to the back to fetch a drill for a bracket I had not yet admitted we'd need. The sound of the drill 3 rooms away became part of the new day's music. Like the click of track lights and the sigh of HVAC and the analyst's cough of a buyer deciding to return at 4. We didn't discuss schedules, not yet. The pact had a clause about only planning when everything else could carry it. But there was a way our eyes met, mine and Eve's by the dimmer as she checked the 9th label for alignment, mine and Cass's at the counter when she refilled the water in the flower vase by the guest book, mine and Veronica's when she crossed the room with a brass tape and handed it to me as if passing a baton. That said we would keep the language we'd made and use it when it added to the day rather than cracking it. Just before noon, a cloud moved and the front room shifted by 10 degrees of color. The varnish on the landscape grabbed it and turned it into a long afternoon. The blue refused to be bullied. The portrait acquired a sternness I hadn't granted it before. The room explained itself again and I was grateful to be the sort of person who shows up for second explanations. "Lunch," Veronica said, which in her voice sounded like an agreement among equals rather than an instruction. We ate standing, because that's how you eat when the work is the thing and the food is what lets the work continue. Cass told a story about a collector who insisted on reframing a piece in a Baroque monstrosity. Eve counted with the time she rescued a watercolor from a fog machine. Veronica said nothing for 15 seconds and then a sentence about a young painter who learned too fast to curate herself out of the work. The silence before it was part of the sentence. In the afternoon, a school group appeared without warning and left a trail of clean questions. "Why is that blue mad?" one asked Eve, and she managed to honor the child and the painting at once. "It's not mad," she said, "it remembers something with force." The teacher mouthed thank you and took notes. Cass hid her smile in the crook of her elbow and later admitted to me she had wanted to high-five the kid and suspected it would be frowned upon. By 4, the buyer returned and bought the blue. He asked for delivery next week, which was a kindness to our calendars. He did not haggle. Veronica let him tell himself that he had negotiated with the gravity of the piece and kept her dignity on a leash called price. She signed the paperwork with the pen she uses when history is being written without anyone calling it that. When the door closed again, she exhaled in the kind of way that makes a room lighter rather than smaller. "We did well," she said, which included more people than the we technically described. "We did not celebrate. We aren't those people. Or at least we aren't those people at work." Eve wrote "sold" on a red dot with handwriting that would have made a monk soothingly jealous and placed it at the label's corner as if awarding the wall a medal for not buckling under the weight of attention. Cass boxed the receipt, taped it with a sharper flourish than during courier time, and put a copy under the desk in the drawer that holds the tools she trusts. Tom walked by and said, "Nice," in the tone of someone who knows enough to leave victory alone while it cools. As late afternoon thought about being evening, Veronica stood in the doorway to the front room and looked at the curtain. Still tied back from morning, the city beyond had started its noise again, the same noise it had insisted on yesterday before the gallery informed it otherwise. She didn't touch the velvet. She didn't need to. It was enough to know that if she did, the sound the fabric made would mean exactly what it had meant the night before. We would use our light when we wanted it and not when the street demanded performance. We closed on time. We swept. We reset tools. The ladder leaned where ladders lean when they've done right by a day. Eve checked the thermostat because she doesn't let machines have the last word. Cass scribbled a note I would read later and laugh at, about the buyer's tie and the portrait's judgment. Tom locked the back door and rattled it once because rattling is how you make a lock decide to hold. Outside, the evening admitted it had been watching and tried not to show it. Inside, I put my palm flat against the wall where the blue had hung and felt the tiniest residue of heat the tracklight leaves when it has done its job. It could have been my hand. It could have been the room. It could have been the day. Finishing. At the threshold, Veronica touched my elbow with the side of her hand, a gesture too small to be read as anything by anyone who wasn't already fluent. "Next week," she said, without a question mark, "if it suits, we'll use the thread," I said, because agreements require their agreed-upon place to be themselves. Eve met my eye as she folded her scarf. "Gentle," she said, reminding the weather how it ought to behave. Cass pointed at the track lights. "Now dark marks," she said, and grinned in a way that sharpened and trusted at once. The door side shut and penned the day behind it with a stroke that felt like a well-sprung clasp. On the street, the lights did what lights do. They told their version. The gallery, noting the disagreement, kept its own, and we, four adults with a pact that was as much architecture as ethics, walked into an evening we would choose with the same care we had offered a blue that knew how long it took to become itself.